right. And 3, 2, 1. And with me tonight, again, coming back to the paradigm shift, Leo Zagami. Hi, Leo. How you doing?
Great. I love your microphone, man. You have a great mic.
Yeah, I had a desk one. It's right here, and I'm always like this when I'm talking in it. So, I like the arm. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a good quality mic.
oh, thank
It's
you.
like,
That's great, and they're affordable too.
ah,
Well, how you been since you've been on the show last time? Lots happened in the world.
yeah, absolutely. And of course, I'm always busy bringing out the new book projects. I completed the last time we talked the Illuminati Confession series with Volume 12, and now I have a new book instead dedicated to the rise and fall of a Frankist monster, who is, of course, Jeffrey Epstein. Exposing Epstein and the most powerful Jewish sect in the world. So, a lot to discuss in the realm of influence that this very little known movement that became a very obscure sect has done within the last few centuries within Judaism and even the history of Israel itself.
And I love the cover. I mean, that's
Yes, the cover. I mean, I must say that I always come up with some original ideas, and I have a great partner to then develop them to the fullest, who is called Vincenzo Viceversa. He's in Italy. He's a graphic designer, a maestro, an expert of occult symbolism in his own right.
yeah.
So he actually used to be a member of the Temple of Psychic Youth during his youth.
Oh wow.
And then after he developed, of course, he is now much more evolved. He was somebody who I've been knowing forever. I mean, I first met him in 1989, so we share a really long friendship.
Yeah, that's a long friendship for sure. Well, that's great. And you're mentioning Jeffrey Epstein, from what I hear.
Yes, Jeffrey Epstein, you see, in this case, the symbology of Frankenstein is connected to the Sabbatean Frankist because it was partly inspired. I mean, I'm quoting Rabbi Antelman, Jacob Frank inspired the name Frankenstein aside from the Castle of Frankenstein. And then you have, of course, Jeffrey Epstein as a symbol of the mad scientist who creates, wants to create something bigger than himself, and he is at the same time himself also a monster, just like in the Frankenstein novel of Mary Shelley, who goes out of control. And of course, we know what happened to him after. I mean, there is always some obscure legend of him disappearing in Antarctica. In this
Right.
case, we have Frankenstein who disappears also at the end, and we don't know really where he ends up. But in the cold scenarios of the North, in that case. And I must say that we had a great synchronicity with Halloween. It was our intention, and also, of course, the new film dedicated to Frankenstein, which is, I must say, a masterpiece in its own right. Very well done. I mean, it is, of course, a movie that is very engaging, and I must say, very well put together. But there has been so many movies about Frankenstein because Frankenstein is in itself a novel that inspired also a bunch of films that, of course, right from the very early days of the cinema industry, but so has also the Golem, which is in itself a part of Jewish folklore, which seems to have also inspired partly Frankenstein, this creation of clay, which also gets out of control and for some kills its creators, for others simply is something that was created to defend the Jewish community, but then, of course, went on a rampage, and the golem, it's
Oh, wait,
also
wait, wait,
very
wait a minute.
important.
Frankenstein was created to protect the Jewish. It was like a folklore or something.
No, the golem was you see Frankenstein was actually based partly on the golem, the name, of course, partly inspired by Jacob Frank, the husband of Mary Shelley, or at least the future husband of Mary Shelley, who put together this novel. He had then written later The Wandering Jew, so he had very much knowledge of such topics. But the golem is a creature that allegedly was created by a rabbi called Judah Loef ben Bezalel, who in Prague, which then became the capital of alchemy, of mysteries, surrounding also, of course, John Dee, who also went there with Kelly, and so the golem is in itself something that predates the Frankenstein tale, but is also a very inspiring story. And in fact, there were very early movies in the silent movie era based on, especially on the golem written by Meyrink, who, by the way, was also somebody who had a lot of esoteric knowledge. You see, the golem gets created by these rabbis who use the Kabbalah in an inappropriate way, let's say. The legend, of course, tells us of a creature that is manifested through these magical names of God. And of course, it's like a sorcerer that creates this crude automaton kind of figure. And that is a little bit what Frankenstein is. So there is a lot of similarities. And that's why it's been said that it was inspirational for Mary Shelley, who, of course, took her inspiration soon after also the Sabbatean Frankist movement had manifested. And within the novel, we have cited, I think, even Paracelsus. We have also cited the fact that Dr. Frankenstein went to school in Ingolstadt, which is the place where the Illuminati were founded. So we could also connect the symbology, let's say, of Frankenstein in a way also to the Illuminati, that get created within the frame of Freemasonry and that get out of control, just like the monster of Dr. Frankenstein.
Wow. And we're living that today.
And yes, of course. I mean, you see, there is today a lot of hate towards the Jewish community and towards Judaism in general. But my book wanted to be very respectful. In fact, I'm very glad that I have received praise by people, even in the Hasidic community, because it is very out of the ordinary that somebody who is not a practicing Jew puts together a book with so many details about a sect which has only been discussed by a few Jewish historians, Israeli, like Gershon Scholem, for example, one amongst the most known, who was also known for his vast knowledge of the Kabbalah. But even today, if we go into the universities in Israel, it's a topic that kind of, it's not deemed comfortable within, let's say, the Jewish world. Mainly because as you read this book, you understand that a lot of rabbinical schools had been compromised even within the most orthodox factions, not only the liberal ones, which are themselves a product of the Sabbatean Frankists, especially because Sabbatean Frankists became the first one to then inaugurate or at least to join a situation where they had a lodge, a first lodge of Freemasons who were open to the Jews, who then manifested in a secret society known as the Asiatic Brethren, a secret society of great influence, who will become very influential with all the secret societies of the 19th and even the 20th century. I'm talking about a secret society that was deemed as one of the foundation elements for the Ordo Templi Orientis of Aleister Crowley, a figure which once we analyze closely, we see is very much connected with what the Sabbatean Frankists did. You see, the problem is that at the time, I guess, of Aleister Crowley, like I explained in my book, there wasn't even that many Kabbalistic texts translated from Jewish into English. The few, it was quite rare. But at the same time, we have to understand there was also Christian Kabbalah before that, and there was, of course, a manifestation within the Jewish community when these two alleged messiahs came around, Sabbatai Zevi and then Jacob Frank. They were mixing elements from various religions. They were being syncretic in a way that is typical also of the Illuminati, because they are the inspiration for a lot of what went on in the Illuminati. Just think about the fact that the epicenter of the Illuminati was, of course, Germany, and Frankfurt became then one of the most important banking centers, and that's where Jacob Frank in particular was received like a king on earth at the time, and then he retired nearby in Offenbach in a castle until the end of his life. And he was very much inspirational with this influence he had, especially within a Freemasonry in Prussia and what is now Germany, that was, let's say, close to the Jews. And instead, because of the Asiatic brethren, it opened up also, though it wasn't enough. And in fact, later on, the B'nai Brit was created, which I also explain in my book, the connection with the Sabbatean Frankists. However, it is definitely a very interesting book in regards to the connection to Epstein, and not only Jeffrey Epstein, but also, of course, his main accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, who both come from families who have their roots in the areas that were infested by the Sabbatean Frankist heresy. And the father of Ghislaine Maxwell was particularly fond of Jacob Frank. And so we have here a analysis of the Epstein case, which is very original. And, you have so many journalists, so many authors talking about this topic that is really difficult to bring out something new now. But once you open this book, you realize that nobody has really taken this angle to the story. And this angle is important because it makes us understand the weakness even of the state of Israel from its very foundations. And that was recognized. I had friends who were religious Zionists who came to me and said, Leo, we no longer believe in religious Zionism, because Zionism in itself, like you say, was already a compromise of two factions, the secularized factions of the Jewish world, which was secularized, by the way, by those Jewish people who had pushed within the realm of the Illuminati, the philosophie sociale. We have to understand that in this book you will find, for example, a direct relative of Jacob Frank involved with the French Revolution. So we're talking about a very important moment and very inspirational for what is the philosophie sociale, which is considered at the basis then of the thought that was carried on of modernizing society in the direction that then we also saw with, of course, the American Revolution also. But we can say that probably in all this story, the most intrigue us is the fact that then these people arrived here in America and they constitute themselves an alternative to Freemasonry with the B'nai Brit, because it was German Jews who arrived in New York who felt that the people back in Germany, their relatives and stuff, didn't have the same opportunities as the Jews here. Here there was not really a restriction. Actually, here, I must say, it was like more Freemasonry adapting to the Jews than the Jews adapting to Freemasonry, because even in the Albert Pike reforms, you can see that element, the fact that maybe you want to take off certain Christian elements to not make it awkward for them when they join the upper degrees or teachings within the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, something that was also pointed out by Crowley at one point. But in any case, for people who want to go through this book, I will suggest to really have an open mind about what they're going to find in it. Because I start from pedophilia in modern day Israel, why
Right.
there's such a wide acceptance, and then I carry on from there, and I bring you this incredible story that then ends up with Oliver Cromwell, the beginning of what then later on became from Christian Zionism, then Zionism. And this is really the basis of today's problems in our society,
Sure.
all the various, let's say, misunderstanding, but always respectful of the fact that my approach is not anti-Semitic in any way, shape, or form. It is about denouncing, and in fact, the people, even within the Jewish community who got this book, have told me, Leo, we really like the fact that you have stressed this element that the actual victims, the first victims, are the Jewish people themselves, or even the people who are living in today's Israel.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. And wow. So there's, I think when most people think about Jeffrey Epstein, because that's really his name, not Epstein, it's Epstein.
Yeah.
Well, people call him Epstein, but it's really Epstein.
No, it's Epstein. And the Stein is a very important element in the Jewish also interpretation of names, letters, and numbers, which, as you know, are part of the Kabbalistic and mystical interpretation. Because when you see Frankenstein, that Stein stands
Sure.
for stone, but also there is an element that is connected with the Ein, which is in itself also a letter of great importance. So you have to understand that in the Jewish language, nothing is really left to, there is nothing superficial about it. There is maybe a deeper meaning that many people need to understand, but of course, not everybody is a Kabbalist. Not even the majority of Jewish people understand the Kabbalistic interpretation of their language. I remember once a rabbi said, probably you know more about the Notaricon and Gematria than myself, so please explain me because, I'm having some problem. But I think that we are here in front of a situation today of growing anti-Semitism, mostly because these factions are played against each other, no, in modern society, but also within Israel itself. I explain how you have the birth of Zionism at the end of the 19th century, the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, a compromise between different kinds of Judaism, because at that time you had the Ashkenazi, who were, of course, more modern, more European, more. Then you
Right.
have the Sephardi, Sephardic Jews, who are, of course, much more Middle Eastern in nature. Then you have the Yemeni Jews. Then you have the Ethiopian Jews. I mean, and putting together all these different identities, it wasn't always easy. And at times, of course, it led also to inside criticism. There was a compromise, and that compromise is symbolized by the Star of David, which is not really the symbol of Israel. It's the menorah, the symbol of Israel and also of Judaism. Star of David is a compromise of two triangles who represent the opposites, really. In this case, the more secularized vision of people like Theodor Herzl about all those modern Jews who have grown up in Europe. And because of the Sabbatean Frankist element in those lodges of Freemasonry, of the Illuminati, had gradually abandoned religion. Their interpretation wasn't so strict. Sabbatean Frankism created a reaction also by giving birth to the Hasidic Jews. I mean, Hasidic Jews didn't exist before Sabbatean Frankism came around. It was like it created so many problems, this deviance from the traditional interpretation. I mean, like I say many times during my interviews, I mean, Sabbatean Frankists, I explain, of course, their beliefs in this book, but just to make it very simple, they will eat pork on holy days. They will swap wives. They will do sexual magic based on their very twisted interpretation of Lurianic Kabbalah. This is like completely satanic in nature.
Right. Boy, the Masons are just into everything.
The Masons, you see, and this is very important, in fact, in this book here, to understand that in the 18th century, when speculative Freemasonry was codified and launched from England, that was the moment in which one of the most eminent representatives of the Sabbateans arrived in England, forced by the persecution in mainland Europe, where because at that point, rabbinical council started to establish a sort of inquisition for what was going on. And so they pushed people like that out of their communities. But because of the nature of the Sabbatean Frankists, they could simply go somewhere else. In this case, this gentleman here, who this painting is very obvious with the compass and everything, Dr. Falk became the most influential figure within Freemasonry at the time. He became influential. He went to London after being persecuted in continental Europe. And in London, of course, he found some bankers who were connected with Frankfurt who started to give him money. But at the same time, he was next door neighbor to Emanuel Swedenborg. He was connected with Count Cagliostro and the Illuminati. So
Wow.
he made a special magical ring for the Duke of Orleans. So it
Wow.
became like his powers, he was very much into manifesting those magical powers, but also teaching them to the Illuminati, even if they were not necessarily Jewish.
Wow. Dark magic, right? That sounds like dark magic to me.
Well, the basis of modern Satanism is to be found in the Sabbatean Frankist. I mean, Anton LaVey was from Thessaloniki, it's a Sabbatean hotspot where 90% of the Jewish families were Sabbateans. So it's before they were removed from Thessaloniki after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, when the Greeks have to make this exchange thing where they sent them back to the Ottoman to mainland Turkey. Thessaloniki, which is Salonik in old days, was the hotspot of a very much a connection, because it wasn't only the Jewish merchants present there, it was the Sabbateans who, after Sabbatai Zevi, went there, because then Baruch Russo, who claimed to be the reincarnation of Shabbatai Zevi, became the second to this trinity, which then was completed with Jacob Frank.
I don't think people realize that, they think of the Jeffrey Epstein thing and it's like to them, this like modern thing, but they don't realize the historical roots that this all goes back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When I show this image right at the cover, the image here that of the temple of Little St. James, and I explain how the temple of Little St. James was actually built to resemble, like you can see here,
Wow.
a holy hot spot for the Sabbateans in Aleppo, Syria.
Look at that.
So it's the same, basically. You see, they look pretty
That's
much.
a connection right there. Definitely.
Yes, no, but also it was a hot spot for the Sabbateans, that place. Aleppo, you have to understand the fact that there was this Shabbatai Zevi guy who declared himself Messiah. Up until 1666, when he was forced by the head of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, to convert to Islam, he had half of the Jewish population worldwide following him. But once he converted to Islam, several 100,000 followers decided to stay with him and actually imitate his conversion outwards. So converting to Islam, but at the same time practicing in secret the perverted teachings of Sabbateanism. it was something that it was permitted to them by the Ottoman Empire, and in Aleppo they had a big base. They were merchants. Let's say always this:
Yes. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Jews have always been great merchants, great bankers. Okay, now the merchants and the banking of the Sabbateans starting to have a hot, let's say, a hot spot in Thessaloniki. But then Jacob Frank didn't want to simply become the Messiah of the Dome. He went back to where he was born. He was born in Ukraine, in modern day Ukraine.
No kidding. Wow.
So all those areas, Poland, modern day Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine, Moldova, then later on Hungary. Then they went down to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They arrived in Vienna. And in Vienna, of course, with the Rothschild, they became nobilitated with Solomon the Rothschild. The biggest banking families are all connected to the Sabbatean Frankists within the Jewish world.
Yeah, what do you think? Well, what about Islam? I mean, what do you think about, things going on today?
But
They,
Islam, you see, the moment in which the Dome converted outwards to Islam, they could really be even more insidious within the Islamic world because they were practicing Muslims outwards. And so they could make deals left, right, and center with them.
wow.
But the curious thing about Shabbatai Zevi, who was born in Smyrna, in Izmir, in Turkey, a place I know very well. Well, the fact is that in this place, where today, by the way, there is a lot of Jesuits in disguise, who also, like Thomas Michel, for example, lived there many years, who used to be the secretary for the interreligious affair of the Jesuits for a long time, and now he's still a professor, I think, in Georgetown. But the thing is that Sabbatai Zevi had a father who was Mordecai Zevi. This story about Mordecai Zevi has not really been discussed enough by any Jewish historian. Even Gershon Scholem liquidates him with maybe 4 or 5 lines. So I wanted to go deeper because he was a representative of the English Puritans, the same guys who came with the Mayflower here to America.
Oh, wow.
And in this book, I explain how the real inspiration for going back to Israel came from those guys, together with some of the Sabbateans who kind of formed this unholy alliance with the certain Jewish Marranos. The Marranos were the ones who launched this crypto-Jewish trend in the Spanish Peninsula, the Iberic Peninsula, which also is Portugal, not only Spain. We had the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, the infamous Spanish Inquisition that went after Jews and after Muslims to purge this whole part of the European continent and bring it back to the Catholic Church. Now, while there were a certain number of Jews who converted genuinely, and they are known as the conversos, then you have the ones who didn't convert genuinely, and they are known as the marranos. And it was the marranos, who means pigs in Spanish, who became very inspirational and very influential because they started doing deals behind the scenes with the Jesuits. And one of them wrote the first book that is the begin. I mean, I don't want to spoil the whole book for you, but it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
the book that inspired the Jews to go back to Israel. It was actually that book that inspired a guy called Menasseh ben Israel, who will come later on, to convince Oliver Cromwell to bring the Jews back to England, where they had been casted out for 3 centuries, and that as a pit stop before bringing them back to Israel. We took a few centuries, but then eventually the English were in charge of Palestine, and they made the deals with, of course, you know the Balfour Declaration. But behind the Balfour Declaration, there is also the fact that they had to convince the religious part of because the religious side of the Jewish people, the Orthodox Jews in particular, they were very much against going back to Israel in a
Oh,
way. I mean, this is why. See, first of all, I want to show you these two gentlemen here. You see the one on top, Menasse Ben Israel, known as the ambassador of the Jews,
okay.
and then this other guy who inspired them, who is this Isaac Laprère. He was a French Jewish Marrano, and
Got it.
he wrote a book that influenced this other guy, and that book said we have to bring back the Jewish people to Israel. So we are talking here about the very fundamentals of the whole thing, and it's not like people will imagine. So once you know, Oliver Cromwell was, for those who don't know history, the only guy who, for a brief time, beheaded a king and transformed England into a republic. Just so you know,
Right.
and he did it also with the alliance that he was putting together with these Marranos, who eventually embraced and sabotaged Zevi. At the same time, to change the perspective that the English people had about the Jews who had been kicked out of the British Isles in I think the 13th century, so a few centuries before, a couple, at least 2 or 3 centuries before, they created this whole story that the English, the Scottish, they were all the lost tribe of Israel, and British Israelism was born. And British Israelism became a big factor later on in the 19th century when the Anglican Church fomented and with the alliance they had at that point, the Rothschilds were basically in charge of the Bank of England under Queen Victoria. But
God, it's
they
all
pushed them.
it's unbelievable.
Yeah, so I mean, when you say Freemasonry played a big role, especially with the Church of England, in embracing British Israelism, which, by the way, I have a very rare book here about the British Israelis, just to give you an idea. It's very rare. It's actually from the 19th century. You
Oh,
see,
wow.
I mean, it was in the library of Korbisky, and
Oh, wow. Look at that.
and it's from with notes from 1899, as you can see. I mean, it's just like,
Wow.
and this is the book, The Anglo-Saxon Race, Anglo-Israel.
Oh, wow. Anglo
It,
Israel.
Yes, in this book, you are basically put in contact with a series of connections that they claim Druidism had with Judaism, the festivities were in parallel, and so they constructed, of course, often artificially, this reality, because then if you go on, with modern DNA studies, this kind of truths can be easily debunked. It's a little bit like the Mormons, or I think, what was it? The Mormons that claimed that the American Indians were the lost tribe of Israel. I mean, it's like, you can create whatever in the heads of people, but then nowadays we have to instead go by the modern DNA studies that, for example, in the case of the Khazarian Jews that everybody talks about in the conspiracy circles, they existed, but embracing Judaism never made them Jews. You don't become Jew. You can embrace the religion, Judaism. So there is no DNA of Khazarian
Right.
Jews. And so the whole conspiracy built around the Khazarian Jews was a scam. But at the time, in the 19th century, this scam was even embraced by certain rabbis who were ignorant and thought there was a connection between the Ashkenazi and the Khazarians, which now has been fully debunked by modern DNA studies. So I dedicated also a chapter to that because I wanted to expose all those fictional claims that kind of linger in the conspiracy circles.
Right.
Because, I mean, there is enough to focus on without going into the speculative realm.
I mean, these are the people that control the money. And at some point, AI and digital ID is coming. And that's what terrifies me.
But that is also something that when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein was and is perceived by the majority of people as this pervert involved in human trafficking and in a spy ring, which is partly true, of course. But there is much more to the character than that. He was also a scientist who had an office in Harvard. He
Right.
was somebody who was working for the creation of Sophia the robot. He was somebody who was working for the spreading his DNA worldwide with a peculiar program that, I mean, not even Dr. Frankenstein could write to that kind of.
He wanted to make a whole race of himself right here
Mhm.
in New
Yes.
Mexico is where the ranch is. And wow, I
No,
mean,
but at the moment, there is not so much talk about the program for evolutionary dynamics that went on in Harvard University because he brought basically all the professors of Harvard University to Little St. James. They are all compromised, not one, all of them.
yeah, we think about celebrities and politicians. You don't think about normal people like business people, corporate people.
But also the people who are supposed to give the education to us, the people who are supposed to have an ethic and a moral, because when I send my
Right,
son to a
right.
university like Harvard, I expect a high moral, a high education, and instead that is not the case.
Wow.
So, he was running this whole thing with Professor Martin Novak. I mean, it's pretty incredible what we are seeing here because he was working with, of course, the whole thing of the spy ring, which was set up by Les Wexner, and before that, it was introduced by the Sabbatean Frankists like Donald Barr, who used to be a Jewish person before becoming a Catholic. And
Right.
that is a typical Sabbatean Frankist who does that. Otherwise, you stay a Jewish and stay within Judaism. You don't change your religion later in life. But then he brought up his son, who became head of the DOJ, his other son, all in the Catholic faith. So Jeffrey Epstein pledged 30 million to Harvard.
Wow. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Jeffrey Epstein basically was working within the frame of Novak's work, which stated that science and religion are two essential components in the search for truth. He was working with Peter Thiel, who now talks about
Right.
the Antichrist, but Peter Thiel comes, his family from Frankfurt, which is a Sabbatean Frankist hotspot.
And he's obsessed with the Antichrist.
Well, but he is the anti. I mean, no, he's not, but he is definitely working for him. And then you see, Epstein's mathematical modeling, his wealth managing role, the fact that with Novak they were adapting very specific, very early experimentation with the AI to hack into what is going on in Wall Street or in other, in the markets. So among traders, they wanted to create for trading purposes these EGT concepts, these replicator dynamics. So they went into these very complex advanced computational methods, which they include account balancing monitoring system and the reserve bank applications that provides institution with the electronic connections to feed wire with access to real-time account balance and collateral information. We are talking about very complex things. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein is not only the maniac. There is a lot more to it than my book, of course.
He's an intelligent maniac. I mean, he knew wealth income and he knew how to generate money. But I'm beginning to think, Leo, after speaking with you, he literally had the whole globe blackmailed. So yeah, it'd be easy
But
to.
remember one thing, and this is important. I explain how he himself was the construct of somebody else. And those somebody else were people like Les Wexner and all his buddies, including Lauder and many others,
All
Steven
right.
Spielberg and all that, that were part then later on of the mega group. Of course, he was working, with people like Ben Goertz, who created the very basis for the AG, the artificial general intelligence, for Sophia the robot, and many other things. But he was initially recruited and given these things. I mean, he was recruited by the Sabbatean Frankist elite because of his background. Stoflowski from the mother and from the father also, Epstein. He was recruited without having, he didn't have a degree to teach mathematics and science at the preppy Dalton School in New York, but he was placed there. And he was then placed in that big building that was eventually given to him by Les Wexner with the power of attorney later on given even to him in the middle of the 80s, rigged with cameras and everything. He was heading an operation. He was generating things that they wanted, of course, from him. And in exchange, of course, they facilitated his whole idea of going into all kinds of things. I mean, he was involved with the Santa Fe Institute, the quantum gravity program at the University of Pennsylvania. He was involved with so many things that is kind of like, but first of all, the people who placed them there, they were the elite, and that elite has never been exposed. That elite is the elite that created the monster as well as the Dr. Frankenstein, let's say.
Right, right, sure. I mean, that Wex Lessner, was that his name? Wex,
Yes, yes. Leslie or Les
the
Wexner.
Victoria's Secret guy, right?
Of course, but that was an operation which he purchased and then launched widely. It wasn't even his own creation originally, but he became, yes, of course, in charge of it, and he made it popular, and
They made a lot of money, those guys.
he made money with that and many other things. But you have to understand, I mean, it's a little bit like um, when you have a guy who gets recruited by the sect leaders, then given this opportunity, the fact that he had passports that he changed every 2 minutes so they didn't see the stamps, the fact he had a passport from, I think, Saudi Arabia or whatever, and it was even, I mean, things that are only possible if you have a link to the intelligence community. But on the contrary of what other books have stated, mine is the only book that states that it's the intelligence community that works for them, not the other way around.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's not like Epstein
yes.
working for the Mossad. It was the Mossad that was working for the Sabbatean Frankists, the Shin Bet, the MI6, the CIA, the FBI.
There's a shadowy hand you can't see, that
Yes,
operates all this. Ghislaine, her
yes,
dad was Robert Maxwell, right?
yes, 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 yes.
And he was a double agent,
He was a triple agent.
a triple agent.
Yes, he was working with the MI6. He was working with the CIA. He was working with the KGB. And he
Wow.
was working actually even with
What
the
did
Mossad.
you
So,
do,
I
right?
mean, no, he was a triple, quadruple agent because he was working also with the Mossad. So, in the end, he ended up being whacked by the Mossad on a deal that he had done
Right.
that they didn't like. And so they basically went on this yacht, which was entitled to Ghislaine, and they killed him. And he was found, lurking there on the surface in the middle of the sea.
Wow.
But his real name was never Robert Maxwell, and
I don't, yeah, I don't think any of them get out alive, to be honest with you, at some point.
no, no, it's not true because, for example, Ghislaine Maxwell is actually
Yeah.
probably going to come out alive because she has compromised enough to come out alive of the whole picture. I mean, Ghislaine Maxwell had an opportunity that was not given to Epstein, that was not given to Jean-Luc Brunel. These are the only three figures that were put in jail. All the very powerful people were never put in jail.
Oh, none of them.
None of them. But Robert Maxwell had introduced actually Ghislaine. This is something Ghislaine Maxwell will never admit. But because she plays stupid when they ask the
Right.
question, who introduced who? But in reality, Robert Maxwell was the guy who was in contact with Les Wexner, with all those other people, because then when in 1991 the mega group was formally founded as this powerful Jewish study group, Robert Maxwell was one of the main, let's say, figures, even if he didn't last long, because after he would become himself a victim of the great game, as they call it in the spy world. His name was Jan Ludwig Iman Benjamin Hock, and it's not the Maxwell family that we have to
Oh,
research in
really?
this case. It's the Hock family that came from what used to be Ukraine, Carpathian Ruthenia, which was a Sabbatean Frankist hotspot. And in fact, in my book, I also show a very early pic of Jacob Frank and of Robert Maxwell,
Wow.
who look pretty much the same.
Oh, look at that. Oh, wow.
And in this research that I conducted, you see, it's also fruit of my own personal experience, a research which I conducted in Russia, where I knew people from the Sabbatean Frankist who at least were, let's say, survived to the persecution that in the Soviet Union people like Stalin had done for most of the Jews, but not the Sabbatean Frankists. They were considered aristocrats. And I explained that in the book. And that is something that I learned when I was actually in Moscow and guested in the dacha of Putin by one of them. So, I mean, some of it is also at times, of course, most is all factual, is all based on academic, incredible sources that can't be debunked. Very rarely I cross-reference also with my own experiences. In the case of Maxwell, that was what then brought Jan Ludwig Idman Benjamin Hock to then legalize his name to Robert Maxwell, because he was simply inspiring his surname to his inspiring leader, which was Maxwell Knight,
Wow. That's crazy.
who was a friend of Alistair Crowley, so, I mean, there is basically always a link with all these people.
I know. It
And,
all connects. It really does. All right, Leo, we only got a couple of minutes left. So uh, tell folks where they can see your podcast and when, and go ahead.
well, I mean, you can always find all my latest articles on leozagami.com together with the links for this book and also all the others. You can also find me on the Leo Zagami Show, which is broadcast on YouTube. I try to survive the shadow banning and the censorship that removed me so many channels during the course of, I was one of the first timers when it comes down to exposing the elite and the New World Order from 2005.
Right. That's right.
And then, how many years later we are?
Yep. You were right the whole time, man.
Yeah, I was right, but also instead of having a channel with 1 million subscribers, because of all the censorship, I have just a few subscribers, and it's, I think, great injustice. But you have to admit that in any case, maybe I still reach a lot of people with my books, and regardless of the censorship, the persecution, the arrest, and everything else that pushed me to even change my own citizenship from Italian to American, in the end, we
Oh,
are still here. And I'm glad that we can always have a great chat on your show. And thank you for having me on for promoting the
Leo, thank
Rise
you.
and Fall of Frankie's Monster.
I mean, I don't know how you fit all that information in that brain of yours, but when you come on, I actually learn things. So,
Well, it's always a pleasure. I mean, I think that is about being able to explain that this is a very complex word. And in fact, that complex word, as you know, I have fitted into those 12 volumes really the basics of it all. Now, with this new project, which is outside of the Confessions, I start a new series of essays, which I hope the people will appreciate. And people tend to read less and less these days. That's a problem. But I think that it's very important to really read, to maintain yourself aware, and to reach a level of awareness. You can't simply read a page on the internet or listen to a podcast. Sometimes you have to really dig deep.
You got to read.
And with all the reference and all the sources I have, then you can also go in your own study and then maybe make your own additional research and maybe write your own book if you're capable.
Yeah, well, I know you do a lot of research when you write your books, and we appreciate you. We really do. We got to have good authors like you out there giving the truth, you know. Leo, thanks for coming on the Paradigm Shift. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, and we speak soon. Take care, my friend. God bless you.
Take care. You too. God bless you.